On YouTube, there seems to be a lot of reviews concluding that the first Spyro the Dragon is just an okay game. Not bad, but not one of the best. But being the arrogant contrarian I am, I have to disagree. I think Spyro 1 is more than just okay. In fact, I'd argue it's one of the finest games ever made. So this video will be completely my opinion, and it's probably best consumed with a pinch of salt. I'm sure plenty of people won't agree with me, which is fine. But even if you disagree, I hope you enjoy my ramblings on one of my favourite video games, Spyro the Dragon. The game starts with a cutscene showing some dragons talking about their treasure and complaining about a chap called Nasty Nork. The dragons insult him, saying he's simple, no threat, and ugly. Understandably, this cheeses Nasty off, and he turns the dragons into crystal statues and unleashes his minions called Norks to take over the dragon lands. This scene isn't perfect by any means, because although Nasty overreacts to the dragon's insults, I don't see why they insulted him in such a blasé manner in the first place. Anyhow, I don't think it's hugely important, because I don't see this scene as a story that Spyro the Dragon is trying to tell, only as a scene that sets things up. I think the real story for Spyro the Dragon is far more interesting and more meaningful. Spyro is the only dragon who can save the Dragon Kingdoms from Nasty's magic, because being a youngster, he's so small that Nasty's spells go right over his head. I think everyone can relate to being a child and wanting to go on an adventure and be the hero. So I think it was a very clever idea for the player to be given a reason why Spyro is the one facing Nasty Nork and his minions, not one of the older and more experienced dragons. That doesn't mean to say that the game only appeals to kids though, it also appeals to old people. My great aunt is actually a big fan of this game. In all seriousness though, like any good platformer aimed mainly at a younger demographic, this game can easily appeal to all age groups. But back to the story for Spyro 1, it's also told through the cutscenes as you rescue dragons. These scenes have good voice acting and good writing. When you free a dragon, they'll give you advice, chat to Spyro, or sometimes just thank you for releasing them. But these scenes also help tell the story of Spyro, since many of the dragons either patronise Spyro, lecture him, or doubt that he'll be able to complete his quest at all. This encourages the player to prove them wrong, and makes the game more satisfying later on when the dragons in the more dangerous worlds are surprised that you've made it that far.
Wow! I never thought I'd be rescued, especially by such a little dragon. What I mean is, I always believed in you, Spyro!
You gotta believe!
And for me, this is the real story of Spyro the Dragon, almost similar to the stories of Bilbo or Frodo Baggins, in the way that it doesn't matter how small you are or who doubts you, if you try hard enough you can make a big difference. As well as that, the story of an unlikely hero allows the player to relate to Spyro throughout the game. It may not be the most original or creative story, but the way it's executed in the game is fantastic, and it adds a little more depth and amusement to the platforming fun. Talking of Spyro, I found him a great main protagonist. He's cocky and headstrong, but he's also courageous and friendly. He has his flaws, but I find this makes him all the more believable and interesting. I've heard people say that he can appear rude, since quite often he isn't interested in hearing stories from the older dragons. But to be fair to him, he's in the middle of a life or death adventure trying to save the dragon worlds, so I don't think he's unreasonable. To be honest, I always found Spyro not wanting to hear stories pretty comical. On top of this, I think Spyro has a great design. He's instantly recognisable as a dragon, whilst at the same time having a unique look. His design is also useful when it comes to the gameplay. When attacking enemies that have fireproof shields, Spyro's horns are used for charge attacks, and Spyro's ability to breathe fire comes in handy for larger enemies. If you enjoy classic platforming, then Spyro is definitely a game for your collection. His controls are tight and easy to master, and his attacks and abilities are a lot of fun. Spyro can glide by pressing X twice, allowing him to reach places quite some distance away. Some people have complained that it's too difficult to judge how far Spyro will glide, and I acknowledge it can be a challenge, but when you get used to it, it is quite a lot of fun, and it's very rewarding to use these new gliding skills to reach secret places far, far away.
I was born to glide.
In order to progress in Spyro, one thing you'll have to do is collect treasure. The levels start with a 100 and 200 treasure count, and that sounds like quite a lot, but while some of the gems only count for 1 treasure point, some count for more, like 2, 5, 10 and 25. So you rack up treasure count pretty quickly. The treasure is a great way of rewarding the player for exploring the levels too, as some of it is hidden pretty well, giving the game replay value if you didn't collect all the treasure before finishing a level. A lot of the treasure is in chests made of both wood and steel. Like with enemies, a different attack is needed for the different chest types, which is good practice learning Spyro's controls for new players. Also, just like the boxes in Crash Bandicoot or blowing stuff up in Silent Bomber, it's very satisfying smashing up a load of treasure chests. The levels in Spyro are a perfect setting for 3D platforming. There are plenty of places to explore and interact with, often with an element of puzzle solving involved in order to reach some of the more remote dragons and treasure. These stages are all a joy to behold. They are vast, colourful and charming. Most levels have a medieval fantasy feel, full of countryside, castles and remote mountains, settings I would say are associated with dragons. But at the same time the levels don't draw too much on cliché, and for every well-known level type or theme, there's something very unique or new. For example, there's a Napoleonic War themed world, but then there's a swamp filled with electricity-obsessed Norks, mountains containing wizards who can control the weather, and a world in the clouds for the dragons who can weave dreams. These ideas are strange and yet fairly subtle, and they suit the fantasy mood of the game. Some people have said that the levels in Spyro 1 look rather bland and uninteresting, but I can't see why. I can only put it down to the game being played on an emulator and on a modern HD screen. To be fair, I think this can ruin the look of most old games, but it isn't the game's fault. They were designed to be played on old CRT televisions that give them a different look, almost a slight blur and glow. I think it'd be great if someone could create a CRT emulator for these games, because for them to look their best, I think they really need to be played on an old television like this. Spyro was actually quite revolutionary when it came to the way the levels look too. A lot of games before and even after Spyro used what's known as distance fog, since these games didn't have the processing power to render long distances. Spyro the Dragon was instead based on a new 3D engine that could render vast views without the distance fog. At the same time, there was a really good amount of detail in Spyro's levels, which was an impressive development back in 1998. Also, it's worth mentioning that when you rescue some of the dragons early in the game, they describe the later stages.
Hey, Spyro! Press the jump button twice to glide, and don't be afraid.
Afraid? Of what?
Falling from high mountain peaks, plummeting into prehistoric glaciers?
Oh, that.
When I was a kid, this got me really excited to see those levels further into the game. Thanks to the game's engine, a creative level design, with excellent settings and a vibrant, yet tasteful colour palette, I was never disappointed when I reached these later stages. The game feels epic and massive. A lot of the levels you can complete pretty quickly by breezing through straight to the end, but I think that's missing the point of the game. You're encouraged to explore in Spyro 1, the dragons recommend you do so, and the player's rewarded with treasure, power-ups, lives, interesting places, and more gameplay fun if they do so. One thing I love about Spyro 1 is that when I was 8 years old, I found some of the enemies could be pretty scary. There are these dogs that transform into creatures from hell, trees that can eat you alive, nightmarish monsters, and these horrible metal bugs. At the same time, some enemies will run from Spyro, and some will cower in fear, only to moon you when your back is turned. So there's a large variety of foes you face, providing entertainment and a good difficulty curve as you progress in the game. As the more frightening enemies only appear later in the game, with the exception of these dogs that appear in the first boss fight, this makes the game even more rewarding, especially for kids, when you face your fears and defeat them. I do love Spyro 2, but I do wish it contained some more scary foes like this game does. I did find this got better with Spyro 3 though, where we saw some pretty scary baddies. Spyro's a fantasy series, and in my mind these sort of games need a certain type of enemy for the atmosphere to be correct, like Lord of the Rings needs its orcs and giant spiders. These more scary enemies help Spyro 1 feel like an exciting quest with real dangers. One detail I really enjoyed in the final homeworld of Spyro, Nasty's world, is that the dragons you rescue are ones that you've already saved. This reinforces the idea that Nasty Nork is a powerful villain, and that the fate of the Dragon Worlds really is down to Spyro. Only he can save the day.
Hey, didn't I already free you?
You're in Nasty's world now, Spyro, and you are the dragon who must defeat him.
Bring him on! I'm ready!
Reach the exit in each of Nasty's lands. Then you can challenge the Nork himself.
In my opinion, that's a good bit of storytelling and sets the mood for the battle with Nasty Nork. And talking of battles, I've heard a lot of complaints about the boss fights in Spyro 1. I think a lot of these complaints are levelled against the first world's boss, Toasty. Before you reach the boss, you land in what I feel is Spyro the Dragon's version of hell. You're in a strange castle surrounded by lava, and there are these dogs everywhere which I would compare to hellhounds. It's pretty intense, and when you reach the final boss, it's this giant scarecrow. When you attack him twice, you realise it's just a sheep on stilts. I can understand that some people might find this too easy, and to an extent it is. But to be perfectly honest, I thought that was the point. Like Papu Papu in Crash Bandicoot, I don't think the first boss always has to be particularly challenging. Also, with the hellish setting, as a kid, I always thought it was quite funny and tongue-in-cheek that this boss was a bit of an anticlimax, and part of the joke is that Toasty is a sheep on stilts. This is because Spyro has a dragonfly following him called Sparks. This guy will protect you from enemy hits, and when he loses all his health, one hit will kill you. To increase Sparks' health, you have to attack small creatures who release butterflies, which he eats. Okay, I accept that's pretty strange, but the point is that one type of creature that you have to flame to release butterflies is sheep. So it makes sense that the sheep want revenge on Spyro. There's even a joke about no sheep being harmed in the production of Spyro the Dragon in the credits. Anyway, I don't see anything wrong with the first boss being pretty easy. I accept that some of the boss battles are more memorable than others, but overall I found them all a lot of fun. And some are pretty challenging, especially Dr. Shemp, Metalhead, and of course Nasty Nork. Nasty Nork is mentioned a lot in the Dragon cutscenes. Somehow, the fact that he's only seen briefly at the start of the game, combined with the fact he's spoken about so much, is a perfect combination for making the player really excited about finally facing him.
You know, I think you just might be the dragon to defeat Nasty Nork.
That's me, all right.
When I was a kid and could only get to the third world for quite a while, I was really hyped up about fighting Nasty, and I think that's exactly how a player should feel about an arch-enemy. Nasty is a great villain for the game, and despite the fact he's not seen all that much, his presence is felt throughout the Dragon worlds. Every level in Spyro 1 has an amazing soundtrack written by Stuart Copeland from the band The Police. Along with the music for Crash 2, this is one of my favourite video game soundtracks. The style of music suits the game perfectly. The organs, heavy metal and synths used create the perfect atmosphere for a fantasy adventure game. Stuart Copeland cared a lot about the soundtrack suiting the atmosphere of the game and not getting old with repeat listenings, and it really shows. I really like the fact that Spyro's theme tune is found throughout the game. This isn't to say the soundtrack's repetitive, especially since the melody is used pretty subtly at times. However, I think it's important it's there, especially later on in the more perilous and vast stages. And this is because, at the risk of sounding extremely pretentious, I'd argue that as Spyro journeys through a dangerous wide world, when Spyro's theme plays within the music, no matter how subtle it is, it reminds the player that despite the overwhelming challenge, Spyro is still there fighting on. A nightmare-themed level called Jax might be the perfect example of this. Like I said, it probably sounds pretentious, but I think this is a clever metaphor for Spyro's determined personality within the music. So overall, I feel the soundtrack for Spyro 1 is nothing short of spectacular. It can be uplifting, exciting, or chilling. Many of the same instruments are used throughout Spyro 1's soundtrack, and the songs all share a distinctive style. But because the instruments and the style are used to so many different effects, and with so many different melodies, every song in the game sounds very unique. And at the same time, all these songs fit together perfectly to form a cohesive soundtrack. In Spyro the Dragon, the charming, inspiring, and unique levels, combined with excellent gameplay, a great protagonist, and a top-notch soundtrack, all creates an experience I find extremely hard to beat. I've heard it said many times that there's a lack of variety in Spyro. I personally don't agree. I accept the game is predominantly platforming, but I can't see why that's a problem. And as well as that, there are so many puzzles, different level types, secrets to find, power-ups, and special features that I've never felt bored for a moment while playing this game. As well as the normal platforming levels, there are also flying levels that are pretty tough. These boats are a particular pain in the arse. The goal of these levels is to collect treasure by flying through hoops, destroying crates and other enemies, all within a time limit. For everything you hit or collect, you gain a few extra seconds, but it can be pretty tricky and there is a puzzle element, as the player has to work out what to go for first and how to make the best use of the time allowed. I remember when I used to play this game as a child, my parents would always be asking me if Spyro could fly, and I would always say, only in certain levels. And they would say, oh, what fun you'd have if you could fly in a normal level. Well, in Spyro the Dragon, collecting treasure and freeing dragons is a lot of fun. but if you collect all the treasure and free all the dragons, and complete the rest of the game's challenges, you're given the reward that everyone wants. A normal level where you can fly. This is a perfect treat for completing the game 100%, and ends the game on a high, quite literally. And when you're a kid and you know that these purple gems are the most rare and the most valuable, this room is just absolutely amazing. Cheese Louise. In conclusion, I think that Spyro the Dragon is an excellent example of a video game. As a kid, this game took me away to a fantasy world full of stunning locations, excitement, challenge, and fun. I don't think it's fair that Spyro 1 is rated as only average. In terms of the visuals and audio, I would say this game is pretty perfect. The gameplay is platforming at its best, and overall I think the game has such a fantastic atmosphere. Although Spyro 1 has plenty of variety in terms of gameplay, if you're looking for a game that's jam-packed with different moves and mini-games, Spyro the Dragon probably isn't for you. It isn't a hugely complex game, but it does contain extremely good gameplay and such a good atmosphere, like I say. But in this regard, maybe Spyro 1's simplicity is both its success and failure. What it does to more or less perfection. It is a game full of good old-fashioned 3D platforming, and it's personal opinion if there should be more to the game, like extra mini-games, harder levels, or extra moves. Personally, I think the game is spot on as it is, but that's my opinion and therefore entirely debatable. But to sum things up, like the musical score, the whole game just fits together in an enjoyable package that should leave the player enthralled and immersed in the strange, childlike world of dragons, knights, wizards, and dreams.